Michael Binkley has been a professional stone sculptor for more than 40 years. He's managed to make a living doing something that he loves, and he's afforded himself a great lifestyle from it, in the sense that he wants for nothing. He's really gone against the starving artist trope. What's fascinating about Michael as well is that he's clearly somebody with a very sensitive and artistic soul. However, from essentially the beginning of his career, which started back when he was 20, he was taught how to think commercially about selling artworks. And so, this conversation, I think, is a fascinating insight into what it's like to try and balance and walk between these two worlds. Along the way, he shares lessons for how to make the making it process easier. And he speaks very candidly about the issues and challenges on this journey. For artists such as ourselves who one day dream of making a living doing our art, I think this conversation will provide great insight into what the life of it is like and a bit of the story behind somebody who's made it such for themselves. I would love to go way back in time, actually, because you started sculpting very, very young, and I think it's a rather unique thing to do. I'm really curious when you were 20 years old getting started doing it professionally. What was going through your head?
It was frustration. 4 years prior to that, when I was still in high school, I had designs to want to become an architect.
Mm,
And through a lot of about 2 years of university at the University of British Columbia, I realized that schooling was just not for me. The summer of 1980, excuse me, when I was
mhm,
20 years old, I came to a crossroads. I didn't know what the heck to do with the rest of my life. And My parents encouraged me to take a art history course in
mhm,
Florence, Italy. It was a university course, but instead of sitting in a university's classroom here in Vancouver and looking at slides, the class actually lived in Florence for 6 weeks. And we
mhm,
got to go to the museums and the cathedrals, the churches, and the galleries to actually see the Renaissance work firsthand. And it was Renaissance and Mannerist history. And People ask me, what it is that got you started in stone sculpture, and I tell them there's a how and a why. And the
mhm,
why was Michelangelo, because during that experience, we were taken into the Accademia del Belle Arte and given our lecture on David, which is a spectacular sculpture,
mhm,
undoubtedly. But what really grabbed me and grabbed my attention were the unfinished slaves that Michelangelo was carving for Pope Julius II's tomb. And there's
mhm,
four of them that are on display in the gallery, and you walk past them on your way to see David under the skylight. And I would say 95% of the visitors to the gallery just scoot past everything
mhm,
and just go right to David. But I realized at that time, because what I did realize is that I was looking at those four unfinished pieces of stone, and you've probably seen lots of photographs. Your viewers have probably seen photographs where Michelangelo carved as much of a figure to see that they were trying. They were looked as though they're trying to emerge. Or trying to break themselves free of their marble prison. So there's torsos and legs and arms, but there's still much of the original stone block that's still on these sculptures.
mhm,
But I could see in my head all four of those sculptures looking the same way as everyone else in the room was seeing the finished David.
mhm,
So I thought, I can see inside rock. This is weird.
mhm,
And I came home from that experience, and just like a lot of other lucky opportunities that happen to certain artists and certain people in the world, we had a family friend who was, of all things, a furniture salesman,
mhm,
who at 40 years old decided he was going to change careers and follow his passion, which was stone carving. He was doing it as a sort of a weekend hobby. But he
mhm,
was sick and tired of selling office furniture, so he moved to Vancouver and decided he'd like to try and make a go of it as a professional stone sculptor. And
mhm,
I asked him, can I hang out for a summer and just sort of learn the ropes? He said, sure. So that 2 month summer, July and August, turned into, geez, Mike, you might have something here as far as the talent goes. Do you want to still work here? And I then worked for him for a year. And in classical art, the apprentice usually pays the master to learn. But I was very fortunate because George had, this gentleman's name is George Pratt. George had several large commissions in his queue that needed work done on them, and they were granite ones. So he said, if I hired you to do the grunt work, remove all the superfluous stone that's needed before I can dig in to start actually carving the figures of these two commissions, would you be willing? And I'll pay you. So I got to learn how to carve granite and get paid for it in the process. So the why was Michelangelo, the how was a gentleman by the name of George Pratt. And I attribute not so much his ability, his knowledge on teaching me how to carve stone. That was sort of took a back seat to a very much more important lesson, or series of lessons that I got from him. Being a salesman at heart, George taught me how to sell the product that you make. And so I thank him still to this day for the lessons that I got to learn on how to make a living as an artist. So it's sort of a long-winded answer to your question. But so when I was 20 years old, I was at a crossroads, didn't know what to do, and those are the events that happened that set the wheels in motion. And I had a moonlighting job at a grocery store. Obviously, one can't just jump out of the gate and start selling your sculptures right away. It takes time. So I had this nighttime job, and so for 7 years I worked 16-hour days and worked darn hard to get the sale of my work, of my sculptures, to a point where I could quit the moonlighting job, which I did in about 1987.
What did George teach you about selling stone?
Well, all the ins and outs about it. It just sort of, you come down to a very, very basic level, was that you are producing a product for sale. So there was sort of a catch-22, a bit of a backfire, because for many, many years, I'll just sort of give a general example. 3 weeks out of every month, I would start my day saying to myself, okay, if I'm going to work today, I'm going to make a sculpture. Will it sell? And so I'm going to have to make something that I think would sell. And the fourth week of the month, I would do my dream projects. And so consequently, I mean, it was fantastic. I was able to make a living as an artist doing this, but I often wonder, and if one looks at my my YouTube video on my visit to the Vigeland Sculpture Park in Oslo, Norway, I asked the question: if I had a patron that said, "Doesn't matter what you make, Michael, your life expenses are looked after," what direction would my work have gone into? So it was pretty much the lesson was I was making a commodity for sale, and to try and make it as attractive and beautiful as possible to attract a customer. And scale back then was very instrumental. George's mentor was an artist from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. His name was E.B. Those are two initials, C-O-X. His last name was Cox. And E.B. figured out a way to make an original stone sculpture that was the scale of something that could sit in the palm of your hand. And he affectionately called them coffee table sculptures. And back in the 80s and 90s, they were extremely popular for me, especially animal images. Uh,
Mm.
and so trying, making a product that one could retail for under $500, and it was something that was very attractive
Mm.
for. So the lessons of working in a smaller scale, um, using the tools that we do use to produce work quickly and efficiently, and try to keep the profit margin as high as possible,
Mhm.
were all the lessons that George taught me.
Mm. Where do you think your work might have gone if you did have such a patron who let you do just any kind of project you would have liked to have done?
I often I have no real answer to the question. Although I do work in sort of my three idiom categories that I parse out my work on my website is
Mhm.
pure abstracts, animals or wildlife, and then the human form. And the human nude is my favorite subject matter for my art, both my 2D and my 3D,
Mhm.
going back to my inspiration from Michelangelo. So I postulate, I guess, that perhaps maybe I would have, pursued that and then developed that.
Mm.
Although I think it would have been very, very hard. I think I would have had to keep that moodlighting job for many more years, because unlike the East Coast of North America or Europe or just about anywhere else in the world,
Mm.
the West Coast of Canada is very, very conservative. And
Mm.
so the human nude in art is sort of is something is a challenge to find patrons for.
Mm. Mm.
And we didn't have the internet back in the 80s and 90s. Didn't have websites. Didn't have the ability to reach a broader audience other than geographically Vancouver and visitors who came to it.
Mm.
So I think my dreams would have gone in that direction to more figurative work,
Mm.
but I don't know, how far I would have gone with it. So
Yeah, yeah. And you've been doing it for a really long time. You would have actually seen boom cycles and bust cycles economically too. How has that ended up affecting the work you do and how hard it is to sell or stuff like this?
well, it's right now it's very interesting because I am 64 and I'm thinking of winding things down as far as the stone sculptures going, but I still want to be creative. Um, for many, many years, for 45 years, I groomed patrons that were older than me.
Mm.
And so consequently, as of about 10 years ago, they got enough Michael Binkleys. They don't want any more. Um, and the new 20, 30 somethings that are coming up in the world, especially like in Vancouver, I don't see them purchasing art the same way as generations above me, older than me,
Mm.
used to do.
Mhm.
So my wife and I, who's my business partner, is we've been wrestling with this issue because not only we've had to deal with COVID, but we've also had to deal with a new buying demographic.
Mm.
My hopes are that I have enough of experience, that the work that I can produce. I don't produce any smaller pieces anymore because, as I say, like that kind of market has dried up. Um,
Mm.
so the work that I'm doing now is sort of what I call sort of gallery size or monumental, um,
Mm.
and trying to find that demographic of art collectors in the world. The what I guess what economists call the 1% of 90% of the world's wealth,
Mhm.
is like the 50-year-olds and above. Um,
Mhm.
they still have the disposable income and they also have the mentality to purchase fine art. Um,
Mm.
the younger generations I see are they want to spend quality on very specific items, like an electric car or an electric
Mhm.
bike or a very very high end mobile device, or like an eye, like a what they call the eye watches,
Mhm.
pieces that that I think are sort of geez, I had the term on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember now. But so just very specific items, but as far as spending money beyond that, they'll spend money on experiences,
Mhm.
but they don't want to spend it on a piece of sculpture for their home. Um,
Mm.
so we're having to sort of change and shift now in the last 5 to 7 years to try and find a new way of marketing, both marketing my work, but also finding new buyers.
Mm.
That's so that's now. I mean, there's been the recession of the late '80s, the early '90s.
Mhm.
There was the financial crisis of 2008, which I found for me didn't affect Vancouver as much
Mm.
because we had a little something called the Olympics in 2010. So
Mm.
there was kind of a sense from a lot of my buyers and patrons back then that, oh yeah, the rest of the world is collapsing, but we're okay. Things continued until about 2012, and then we hit the hangover.
Mm.
There was another portion of time there from 2012 to 2015, 16, where we had to really sort of adjust. So yes, there have been times in my 45 years where there have been hiccups,
Mm.
but I mean, every business goes through that.
Mm. Mm. Who was your first patron?
Well, ironically, it's my father,
Mm.
who, when I came home from my first day working with George Pratt, I said, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I think I want to become an artist." And that
Mm.
was a kick in the shins to my father, because he said, "You better. That's all well and good, but make sure you get a real job."
Mm.
Um, and Ironically, the first sculpture that I made was out of
Mm.
limestone, and it was a sort of was a leaping dolphin. And I sort of look back on it very fondly. My father said, "I'm going to buy that from you, and I'm going to give it as a business gift, a
Mm.
corporate gift to one of my customers." Uh,
Mm.
so even though he had said, "You better watch out. This is not really the path you should be taking,"
Mm.
he was the first person to support me.
Ah, that's really sweet.
Yeah.
And you recall as well, like, I guess the process of the first time you tell your parents, like, I'm going to become an artist, and then seeing artistry actually become more and more a part of your life. Was it something that they warmed up to quite fast? Did it take a bit of, you know, negotiation, so to speak?
Well, if you watch my 30th anniversary video that my wife made of me, because we were wondering, that was a check-in just to see how far I had gone and come at that point in my career. I have always attributed and thanked my mother because God bless her. I mean, I probably was drawing with crayons on the wall of the house that I grew up in and driving
Mm.
her crazy.
Mm.
But she realized that I did have some artistic potential. So all through my life, I remember her saying to me, "You should be an artist. You should be an
Mm.
artist." But the flavor of the times back in the 60s and the 70s was art is, it's a passion, but it's not a vocation. You can't make a living as an artist. So I never really thought of it in those terms until 1980.
Mm.
And it was, my father took about a year, because I worked to get together my first show, and I've been primarily self-represented for 45 years. That was
Mm.
another sort of small lesson or big lesson that George Pratt taught me, was how to produce your own exhibition of work. Um,
Mm.
and I sold quite a few sculptures.
Mm.
And the show was actually, because I was still living at home in my parents' house, was I took over their living room and dining room. and set it up like as best as an art gallery as it possibly could make, as a, back in the 80s, in 1980, as a 20-year-old. And I sold a lot of sculptures. Now, my father was at heart a salesman as well. He worked in the graphic ink industry. And I think he probably sat back on his heels and went, "What? You sold your work? Oh." And so I had another exhibition the following year, and he said, "Michael, you know what you should do? You should probably bring home some raw pieces of stone, and we'll put them under we had a cantilevered floating hearth in the living room. We'll put some of the raw stones underneath the hearth so that you can show people what these sculptures look like before you started working on them, because people will probably think that's pretty cool to see the original stones." So he very quickly turned around and became a supporter.
So your first sale was to your father. What about your second and third buys? Did those come from that first exhibition, or who were they?
Probably. It's a long time ago, and I can't remember, chronologically how things happened. But I do recall making several sales from that exhibition, and they were probably the ones that solidified and made me think, okay, there may be something here. I should maybe try to do this a bit further.
That's interesting. So back in Italy, when you were looking at the rock and you said, "Oh, I can see into stone," do you feel like that was the moment that you were like, "I'm going to become a sculptor," or was it still just a bit of a dream? And then how did that change after you?
No. I mean, I'm 20 years old. Been very, very shy as a teenager, more interested in skirts than a vocation. So no, it was just something. I came home from that experience. I thought, I'm totally lost. Don't know what I'm going to do with my life, and I need to find something to do, because I can't be an architect anymore. Maybe I'll just give this a try for the summer, working in George Pratt's studio, and just see what happens. And just like what happened to you, I got bitten by a bug, and I not only did I find a way to make something that could sell, I actually liked getting dirty, because stone carving is a very, very messy and dirty way of producing art. I like doing it, and it's physically hard work. And I thought, okay, it's a way to burn off a lot of the pent up energy that I had. So those were sort of like the driving forces that said, okay, let's see if we can make this into a vocation. But no, when I was in the academia, sitting there looking at these sculptures and going, "Wow, I think I can imagine what Michelangelo was trying to do with these unfinished pieces." It was never like, at that point, never thinking to myself, "Hey, I think I can make a living of this." I just thought, I'd like to go back to Vancouver, and I'd like to at least try this.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty awesome how it all ended up working out. And back to some of those lessons that George taught you way back then. What did you learn about representing yourself? I guess first of all, I'm curious about how to throw a gallery when you're 20. The other thing as well is the actual decision to go this route of mostly representing yourself rather than going the more like gallery type way. So what's the story there?
Well, I wasn't entirely self-represented. George taught me that you should go out and see if you can find some third-party representation, because you're not going to. I mean, my first list of invitations, which literally like the neighbors in the neighborhood, which were parents of my friends that I grew up with on the street, and the list was probably a dozen, maybe 15 people. So you just can't you can't make like livelihood out of 15 customers. Not all of them bought something either, right? So so George said, yeah, you should probably try and find some third party. And for the 1980s, I did that. got my work on consignment on several. There were mostly, back then, there's what one would call high-end gift stores. Because, as I mentioned, like, these are smaller scale sculptures, nothing more than about 8 inches in maximum dimension in any direction. And trying to keep most of the inventory, in a retail situation, sort of under $500, which was, a substantial amount of money back in the 80s. So that's what I did. I was, at one point, I think I probably had about 10 different locations, but concurrent to that, George said, you've got to have your own exhibition every year. So the first 2 or 3 were at my parents' in their home. And then I got my own apartment, so I had a show in my own apartment. And then George and I moved locations because the World Expo was happening in 1986 in Vancouver. And the original location where George had his studio was right smack dab on this property. So we got kicked out of there. And so we moved to a different location, which was on the way into, I don't know if you've heard of this place, but it's probably the most famous tourist attraction in Vancouver. It's called Granville Island. And it's, at the time, there was a very popular art school called Emily Carr School of Art and Design that was on the island. But it was also, it's a place where throngs and throngs and throngs of tourists would come to visit Vancouver. And George found a location on one of the arterial routes into that particular location. So we set up a small gallery there, and so that was the place where I was able to have exhibitions in the future. But I did have my work in a few fine art galleries and high-end gift stores. That ended in 1990 when it became obvious that I was, between Michelle and I, we were able to sell more work than all of the 10 locations combined. So our annual exhibitions were becoming very, very popular, very lucrative. And so we were able to take the work that was on consignment. You can imagine trying to supply a dozen, 15 sculptures to 10. That's like 150 sculptures on consignment in various locations around Vancouver, having to go, because they wouldn't look after it. I had to monitor every month what, did anything sell? Oh, it did. Okay, so where's my check? And do you want more product? It became like a logistical nightmare. So thankfully, we were able to amalgamate and just be represented by our own gallery in North Vancouver at that time.
Yeah, and when you're doing these like sales that you make yourself, what does that look like? Is most of it happening after like an exhibition, or is there any outreach on your part as well? I'm quite curious just what that whole process is like.
Well, right now it's a lot of it is online, but for many, many years it was interaction directly. Customers coming to, we were from 85 until 2016. We were a home-based business in North Vancouver. So people were invited, and they thought it was pretty cool. We got to go to see go and see the artist in his home. And I attribute the success of my work and my sales was most people, they bought half of their delight in the purchase was getting the artwork, but the other half was they got to meet the creator. And see the space where the work was created. And so for many, many years, it was very much a one-on-one, face-to-face sale. Now it's with the internet and with my website, I'm getting more and more sales that are less personal. And so therefore what I've been doing is making these little videos on my YouTube channel that describe a little bit about each of the pieces that I have created, and then and telling prospective buyers the inspiration behind it, the material it's made of, and trying to keep it about 3.5 minutes. So there is a little bit of interaction, but we're sort of one-faced. It's me looking at a camera and talking to people. But those have been helpful. Unfortunately, the location here in Squamish, it's fantastic as a studio. It's brilliant because I finally have a wonderful, fully working stone sculpting studio after many years. But and it's nothing glamorous. It's what's called in North America, and I'm sure it's around the world, the construction process is very similar. It's called a concrete tilt-up warehouse, where a series of units, all the same, made of concrete with a steel roof, are parceled together into an industrial size type park in a location where one can make noise and dust and fumes, and you're nowhere near any residential areas. And so that's what this place is. So the studio was the driving force behind buying this property. The gallery is sort of an adjunct. So we've divided it. You can see there's a dark wall behind me. That's the dividing wall between the gallery, which which I'm sitting in right now, and then beyond that is the studio, which is the big cavernous space where I can make all kinds of mess and dust. But the upshot is that it is not in a high commercial area. Like, we don't have walk-by traffic. So the gallery is very much a destination-based location. So if a customer wants to actually come and physically see a sculpture before they buy it, at this point, it's not something that we're on the way to the coffee shop, and this looks interesting. Let's pop in and see what's in this store. It is very much. I mean, I've got other industrial neighbors that work in the same capacity as I do, is that they're destination based. They have their customers come and visit them, but it's certainly not something where we have walk by traffic that I can coerce and entice people through the beautiful display in the window to come in and see my work.
Yeah.
There are some challenges to this location.
Yeah. And with the main subject matter of your works, you do like a few of these series of types of sculptures, from like abstracts to more figures. How much was this driven by market demand, and what was it like, I guess, developing those styles?
Well, I cannot understand the love of the animal that's four-legged, has fur. It's called a bear. And in British Columbia, we have a lot of black bears. We've got grizzly bears. And in northern Canada, we have polar bears. And for some reason, people just love bears. And I've made my fair share, probably hundreds of bear sculptures in my life. If someone came into the gallery door now and said to me, "Michael, could you make me a bear sculpture?" I think I'd puke. But animals like whales, dolphins, birds, I've probably made almost every different kind of animal you can think of in the world. I've made a snake. I haven't made an alligator, but kangaroos, camels, koala bears, the myriad of buffalo. Anyway, it's for me in Vancouver, Canada, in the 80s, 90s, and the aughts. The animal images reign supreme. So that was something that, going back to that comment I made about the 3 weeks of every month, Those three were probably made, were probably consumed by me making animal images. And then the last week would be, I want to make a figurative piece.
That is quite funny because based on the site, I would not have guessed particularly that animal pieces were perhaps the thing you made more so than anything else.
Well, I'm feeling more comfortable with my pure abstracts. And I think that my designs are getting better now with age. And this can be seen in the 20th century with many of the artists of the early 20th century, like Picasso, Brancusi, and Braque, who all started out being very representational, but ended up going in very abstract directions. But you know, my abstract work that I did when I was in my 20s and 30s was quite flippant. I thought, you know, if anyone could take a bicycle seat and some handlebars, weld them together and make a bull's head and hang it on the wall, I can do that. But I learned that you know, if you look at my abstract work from my early period to the pieces that I'm doing now, and you realize that learning to do work that's representational, you learn about balance, you learn about composition, you learn about form, you learn about positive and negative space. And so consequently, I think that the abstracts I've been doing the last decade have been far superior to the ones I've done the first 30 years. And then exploring more of my true love, which is the human nude. So that's why you see it sort of heavily slanted on my website towards abstracts and figurative work, and not so much of the animal images.
No more bears.
Yes.
Yeah. Over this whole period, what do you think has been the toughest part about the business?
I think it's probably dealing with my own insecurities. When we've gone through a really great summer, so made lots of sales, but prior to that, through COVID, it was pretty touch and go. And so if you're relying on your art for to put bread on the table, and the work's not selling, you become really insecure. And so I think probably has been the toughest thing to deal with all through my career has been the low points, and there've been many, and I know there's going to be more coming. So I've always got to prepare for it. And I do thank my wife and business partner Michelle, because she has been my champion, and been the one that's been my crutch on the times when I've been really, really feeling low. And she, don't worry, tomorrow will be a better day. Just turn up and keep at it. So I think that's probably been my biggest challenge, is my insecurities.
Yeah. What else have you learned about preparing for and dealing with these down periods?
I guess, well, it's the COVID really has made a huge shift in my art practice. So I guess that phenomenon, that world event, really has made me rethink, and triple think my process. So I mentioned to you before that I've in our conversations before we started this podcast, was that I'm what's called a direct carver, and so for many years I didn't produce stone sculpture the way it's classically been produced all through history. And it's just now in the last 7-8 years that I'm going back and reverse engineering my process to learn how to do that. And instead of what you've done is work in clay, visceral clay that one can work with your hands. Make your composition and make your mistakes and correct them with the malleable material. And then once you have what stone sculptures would do, once like, for instance, I always like to use Rodin as an example. Once the composition was once the artist was satisfied with the composition, then they would cast the clay into plaster, and then which was a rigid material, and then hundreds, if not thousands, of different reference points were taken all around the sculpture, and those reference points were then taken to, not like the sculptor didn't do it themselves, they went to a specialist who were like they were staffed by essentially human machines. And they would use mechanical tools to point the plaster into a block of marble. And then when the work was finished, my Rodin would get a phone call, and he'd go down to the stone carving studio, and he would sign the sculpture and then send it off to the customer. I'm learning that process, but instead of using real clay, I'm using virtual clay and sculpting in virtual space on my computer. And through that, learning that, hey, I don't always have to use stone. I can use bronze, I can use brass, I can use steel, I can use fiberglass. So there's a lot of different materials, and so now I'm it's introduced a whole new way of thinking, and certainly that will translate into something that's mobile. So as long as I've got my computer and my monitor, I can be on a beach in Bali and still create sculptures. So that's something that I'm learning through the downtimes, is how to recreate my creative process.
And you've mentioned now that a lot of the work you're doing at the moment is more like monumental or just much larger in scale. How does that look? I'm very curious, actually, like even how on earth does one get a monument?
Well, it's always the dream of whether you're a painter or a sculptor, to do the great piece, to get the commission to do the 12-foot wide painting or the 12-foot tall sculpture. Coming out of the gate, I knew that probably was not going to happen for me. So I just paid my dues and sort of laid low. But through the course of dealing with patrons, you groom them at the level where they buy a $250 sculpture from you, and then 2 years later they come back to an exhibition and say, "Oh, Michael, you're still in business. I wasn't really sure whether you're going to be, but you are. So I like this piece. I'm going to spend $750 on you." And then a few years later, it's like, "Oh, okay. Well, I did have the firepower to buy a $1,200 sculpture, but I wasn't going to do it the first time out of the gate many years ago. But now you're still around for 8 years. You're not dying out on the vine. You're actually creating a career here. So I'm going to spend a bit more money." So the ladder of certain patrons would like the rungs would go higher and higher and higher. So over the course of time, you meet people who they're not just buying for their home. They're going to buy for their company. They're going to buy for a property they're developing, or a larger context. I would love to be able to commission you, Michael, to do a very large piece, and I'm going to donate it to a civic situation where it sits in a park somewhere, or it sits on a property where the property owners probably would not have bought the piece in the first place. So It's just, collaborating and grooming patrons along the way to get to those places. And every now and then, I mean, the internet has been very, very helpful for me. I mean, my commission for the Queen Mary II back in 2004, where I did 3 oversized white marble seashells that still sit around the thalassotherapy pool in the Canyon Ranch Spa on that ship. They found my website, and I actually had a nautilus shell sculpture that was for sale, and they said, like, we'd like you to make some sculptures for our ship. So there's all kinds of avenues that one can that I have experienced anyways, where large scale sculptures and opportunities have come to me.
And is there anything that you wish you would have done differently, just across this whole path, like looking back even all the way back to when you were in your 20s, and or even beyond, maybe it was a mid-career thing?
Well, it's not something that I lose too much sleep over, but going back to that, that discussion we had before, was what would have happened if I had not tried to make a series of sculptures for 3 weeks every month that I knew were going to sell. I know that there's a lot of art collectors out there in the world that probably won't pay much attention to me, because A, I didn't go to an art school and graduate from it, and B, they look upon the work that my body of work as being somewhat commercial, in the sense that it didn't really come from the artist's heart. It was done purely for the goal of making a sale. Which I find, is if that's indeed the case, I find it quite an oxymoron, because every artist dreams of being able to make a living from their art, and a lot of them just, they take the lessons, what little they've had from art school, try to apply it to a vocation, and they just wonder why. When I put a hammer in the middle of an empty room, paint it purple, and call it midnight, how come no one's buying that? Because this conceptual art, that's something that I learned how to do in school, and it's the way of the future. So that's just a lot of the the big art collectors, like the banker who bought Damien Hirst's formaldehyde shark with that tank, the story of the $2 million shark, and it turned to mud the next year. Those kind of art collectors, they probably won't follow me, because they feel that the work that I've done has been too commercial. As I say, I find it ironic, because I've been able to make a living at my work and my art, develop my skills along the way. I mean, what could I could have stayed on as a grocery store clerk, and slowly develop my skills, but I found that by making thousands, and I'm probably looking back, I'm 11,000 individual original stone sculptures that I've done in my career, and have sold. That has been that's been my my learning curve, and developing my style. Done that stocking shelves at a grocery store.
Yeah.
So yeah, would I? There's that. There's a long. I kind of got off our topic here, but would I have done something differently? I just wonder, what would have happened if I dreamed. I suspect I'd still be stocking shelves at a grocery store.
Yeah. And if you had to give some advice to people who are, let's say, in the position you were in actually way back then, and are even thinking through which way am I going to go? Am I going to be more commercially minded? Am I going to make midnight, or maybe not midnight exactly, but follow their heart, so to speak? What advice would you give this hypothetical person, maybe even a young Michael Binkley?
Well, I have and still sort of don't give it much credence, and yet many people have said to me, do you understand? Do you have any idea how much of a risk you took, and how brave you were to do that? I kind of just look back on it as like I felt I was just doing what I had to do. But I think that my advice would be, like, don't be afraid to give it a try. That there's that one, if you approach it with a business acumen, you can make a living at your craft. It doesn't, and there's that saying out there in the world, an artist must suffer. And I've never felt that is that an artist has to suffer physically. In other words, be in a cold garret loft studio with no food and little prospects of a sale of their work. That's not the suffering that I think that we art creative types have to endure. I feel that our suffering is that we can't ever turn off our brains. You look at a lot of regular jobs where someone clocks out at 5 o'clock, and then they go home and they forget about their work, and they just they spend time with their family, they watch TV, and they go to sleep, and then the next day they turn back on at 9 o'clock. My head never turns off. So my suffering is that I can never stop working. So that's the suffering that I think an artist has to endure. But to many people out there who are thinking, geez, I'm in school, or I want to go into art school, or I've graduated from art school, or I decided not to go, like I did, not decided to go to art school, but I really want to see if I can make a go of making a living as an artist. I would say, like, take the leap of faith. It's very, very difficult, and it's more and more difficult these days. I mean, I look at my young nieces and nephew. They're in their 20s and 30s, and the cost of living in Vancouver and in Canada has seemed to outstrip the amount of wage increases. And so it is more and more difficult to start a business, but I still believe that it can be done. It's just you be prepared to work hard. As I say, like Michelle and I, for years, we worked 7 days a week, 11 months a year, and those were 12 to 16-hour days. And that's one thing that I've noticed with my niece and nephew, is that we like this work-life balance. Yeah, I'm just happy with one job. I'm not going to do 2 jobs. I'm not going to do 3 jobs at once. So so I know that there's going to be there'll be consequences to that. But I'd say, yeah, like if don't be afraid to follow your dream, but be prepared to work hard.
Yeah, great, Michael. Thank you so much for your time. I'll stop the recording now.
Oh,
but
thank you for having me.